Okay, welcome everybody to our 1 o'clock panel. My name is David Spence. I'm a professor of energy law at the University of Texas. And we are continuing our discussion this afternoon of the energy transition with a panel that will dive into the aspects of the transition that sometimes don't get enough attention. We tend to hear a lot about the climate challenge itself and possible technical solutions to that challenge. Today, we're going to hear about socioeconomic and socio-political complexity associated with that task, and we've got a terrific panel of experts to help us talk through and understand these issues. And I thought I would introduce our panelists first, and I've asked each of them to make very brief remarks that will help kick off our discussion. So as they speak, please feel free to submit questions for the panelists using the Q&A button on your screen. I believe our first panelists, I think I'll introduce the panelists in the order that I expect them to speak. Jenny Stevens is the director of Northeastern University's School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, and her research and other work focuses on social and political aspects of the renewable energy transformation. Bill Weil has devised and managed corporate sustainability programs for Google and Facebook, and currently is the executive director of Climate Voice, a nonprofit initiative that he launched in February 2020 that's focused on encouraging companies to go all in on the climate. And Clark Miller is a professor at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University, whose work focuses on science, technology, and globalization, including, for our purposes, the social sustainability of these kinds of complex, large-scale technology transitions. So we're looking forward to some interesting presentations and a good back and forth. Jenny, I'm going to turn the floor over to you now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David, and thanks for including me on this panel, and look forward to the discussion. Here are my slides. Yeah, so I recently, I've been working on climate energy issues for my whole career, so the past 25 years. And what I've found is that, we haven't been as effective or as successful in accelerating the transition that we know is needed. And a part of that is very much related to the social and political aspects, not the technology, as David mentioned. So I think what we're going to talk about here today is quite a lot of these other aspects. And I recently wrote a book called Diversifying Power: Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And as a woman working in the energy space, I have realized that diversity really does matter in terms of considering effective strategies for the changes that we need. And so this book it's not really an academic book. It's more of a call to action and inspiring kind of motivational book, giving people suggestions on how to get involved in kind of collective action. And so I think it's appropriate in this session, when we're talking about kind of a new social contract, to consider who is involved, how are we connecting with people, how are people connecting energy with other things that they wake up every day worried about, whether it be jobs and healthcare and food and education and housing. And that's kind of a different way to be thinking about energy and climate, by connecting it more explicitly with what people are worrying about. So if you go to the next slide. So what I talk about in the book is economic injustice and the widening income and wealth gap in the United States. And we don't always think about this as connected to the energy transition or connected to the climate crisis. But I think it's really central. And it's central because, as you can see here in this figure, over the past 4 decades, the concentration of wealth and power has just drastically shifted, with the top 1% having an even greater percentage of share of national income and share of national wealth, whereas the rest of folks are really going down in income and wealth. And this is pre-pandemic. In the past year, this has actually gotten worse. The billionaires have been profiting while most people are really struggling even more than they were before the pandemic. So we don't always think of this as related to the transition in energy, but it really is. And the reason it is because the top 1%, what some of us now call the polluter elite, have really been resisting the transformation. And aren't always aware of all the ways that the top 1% have been resisting the transition, but they have been, and we need to acknowledge that, and then we need to resist their resistance, right? To establish the changes that are needed. So the ways in the past 4 decades, the polluter elite really have been focusing on investing in misinformation campaign to deny climate science, to confuse us about whether or not fossil fuel burning is dangerous and whether it's connected to climate change and whether climate change is really a problem that we even need to worry about. They've also been investing in undermining our public trust in government. So all too often, and as we've seen in the United States over the past few years, that people don't really trust government, and that the government is there to protect our health, protect the public good. And that has also been a strategy. And also there have been investments to minimize worker protections and worker rights in corporate culture in the United States. 40 years ago, people were proud of, a lot of corporations were proud of how they treated their workers. Whereas now there's been a shift in culture, and really shareholder interests are prioritized, and many corporations just minimize how much they have to support or provide for their workers. So that's really a shift, and it's these efforts are really central to why we've been so ineffective over the past few decades in the transformation that we need in our energy system. So next slide. So what I propose is that we think about energy in a new way. Instead of thinking about the climate crisis as something separate from everything else and disconnected and kind of in isolation and kind of a scientific problem that needs a technical fix. Really think when we're in that lens, thinking about climate change in that way, we're missing opportunities for improving the human condition and improving the priorities that we have for what people really need. So an alternative way to think about the transformation is to think about this lens of energy democracy. And that is about really redistributing power, literally and figuratively. So if we acknowledge we're moving away from a fossil fuel dominant energy system to a more renewable based energy system, we can think of that as a way to restructure and reorganize society, right? Because renewables are very different than fossil fuels. And there's opportunities, almost every community in the world and in the country has access to renewable energy that's free and perpetual and abundant and available. So that's why it's so revolutionary to think about a heterogeneous mix of renewable resources that could be locally or regionally owned, and there could be different kinds of and different scales of organizations profiting, not just centralized multinational energy companies, which really has the potential, if we invest in a different way with renewable energy, to invest in people and communities and base those investments on social justice and human dignity, and leverage the urgency about climate change for why we need these big investments in our energy system, and have a lot of co-benefits that have nothing to do with climate, that really can change the way our society functions. Next slide. So in my book, I talk about anti-racist feminist leadership. And what I mean by that is leadership that recognizes the power dynamics and the structural systems in our society that have privileged some folks over others and really disadvantaged whole groups of people, whether it be women, people of color, people of different sexual or religious orientations. And anti-racist feminist leadership is leadership that is based on distributing wealth and power rather than concentrating it, and focused on reducing inequities and disparities by centering economic justice and racial justice and social justice. So for me, this kind of leadership is represented by the Squad, who are these 4 junior congresswomen who came on the national stage just in the past 2.5 years. And they really changed the conversation about climate and energy because they connected explicitly to jobs and economic justice. They connected to the housing crisis and all the investments in housing that are desperately needed in this country. They connected it to racial justice and criminal justice reform as well. And by linking problems together and not thinking about problems in isolation, we're able to kind of envision a path forward for more transformative changes that we really need. And this is in kind of the antithesis of conventional patriarchal leadership, which has dominated our country. And it really is about that kind of leadership is intentionally excluding people. If you look at the photograph here on the left, it's literally all white men. And that's very intentional, right? It's trying to continue a certain kind of power of who has power and who doesn't have power, who has privilege and who doesn't have privilege. And it exacerbates inequities and disparities. And it's to enable to sustain the status quo. It's also really about denying the systemic problems, denying that there's climate change, denying that we have an economic crisis, denying that there's structural racism. And that approach of just denying problems is not effective, and it's not a way to engage and connect with people for a sustained new social contract. So next slide. One of the things that I think we can all think about innovative ways to connect our work on energy and energy transformation with other issues, and not solely focus on energy, and connect with jobs and economic justice, connect with health and well-being and nutritious food, connect with transportation and transit equity issues, connect with housing and educational justice. And when we're able to do that, and within my book, I elevate the stories of lots of innovative, creative leaders who are really making that happen through very innovative ways to connect these issues. We are able to expand our engagement and sustain a real deeper connection with folks, so that we can think about bigger picture changes that people will be on board with because they're benefits for everybody. And this is really a really important piece of thinking about the inclusivity here. So just very quickly here, a couple of the leaders that I elevate in the book are Jackie Patterson of NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And she and her team have done really amazing work pointing out how the fossil fuel industry in particular has manipulated a lot of Black communities to get consent for additional fossil fuel infrastructure, even when those same communities then are disproportionately impacted negatively in terms of health consequences of those fossil fuel infrastructure. And Jasmine Banks of Uncoke My Campus is another leader who has really been inspirational in terms of revealing how fossil fuel interests have been influencing our higher education landscape, and as another form of kind of resisting some of the transformations that we know need to happen. Next slide. So I'll end here with some provocative things, just in terms of suggesting how we can all get involved and leverage our collective power for this larger transformation. And while some of this may seem radical to some people, Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, who's an international leader in climate and energy justice, she has pointed out that if we just focus on what people need, kind of people's first approach, rather than kind of getting distorted into kind of corporate interests over what people and communities actually need, we know that we have been underinvesting in our infrastructure, in our communities, in our people, and jobs for people to have prosperous and healthy lives. So we need to kind of connect our energy transformation work with these larger issues and connect also with thinking about inclusion and diversity and how what we don't want are energy policies that further exacerbate inequities and disparities. And we have an opportunity with the transformation ahead of us to really reprioritize and invest in those families and communities and households and regions of the country that have been underinvested in for too long. And I'll end there just by honoring Shirley Chisholm, who is the first Black woman to run for president in 1972. And she had some really important ideas that didn't quite make it in terms of becoming president at that time. And we have come closer. We're still not there in terms of thinking about representation and who has the power and control in this country, but there's a lot of opportunities ahead. And I welcome the discussion to connect that with the conversation here about energy transformation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Bill, you're up next.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for having me. Delighted to be here, Jenny. Thanks for that. That was awesome. I've got a few slides, so if we can put those up. And this really gets to some of the same points that Jenny made, but coming at it from a slightly different angle. We know we need to move really quickly to act on climate. The IPCC has shown that we need to cut emissions in half in the next decade and to net zero by 2050. And net negative beyond that. And that's going to require everything: individual action, behavior change, innovation, investment, and especially public policy to drive the entire market rapidly in the right direction. And we have broad public bipartisan agreement that government should be doing more on climate, that we need public policies. And the question is, why don't we have the policies we need? And Jenny made this point. I'm going to make it slightly differently. Public policy is about power and influence. And for the last couple of decades, when it comes to climate and energy policy, there's been a massive imbalance in power and influence, represented by this chessboard with the lonely, relatively weak pawn facing the massive forces on the other side. We don't have the political agreement we need, even if we have public agreement. So why not? So on the next slide, I've cited one study that has shown that fossil fuel interests outspent pro-climate advocates by a factor of 10 to 1 in lobbying on climate in the US from 2000 to 2016. We're not talking small amounts of money. According to the studies, the fossil fuel industry spent about $2 billion, billion with a B, lobbying on climate in that period. Almost all of it pushing to delay, deflect, weaken, or stop useful climate policy. And as Jenny said, beyond lobbying, they've engaged in a multi-decade misinformation, or really one could call it disinformation, intentionally misleading campaign to deny the science and deflect responsibility. So that really is the source of the problem. The question is, what can we do about it? And there's actually more to the problem than that. Going to the next slide, influence map has been scoring how companies use their political influence on climate. And their data is really interesting. Their analysis shows quite clearly how the massive influence of the fossil fuel industry has been mostly used to drive delay and inaction. And this chart, so just to explain, the horizontal axis shows where companies are on climate. Are they supportive of climate action? Do they acknowledge the science? Are they trying to stop climate action or denying the science on the left? And then the vertical axis is how engaged are they? Are they really engaged very vigorously with policy to influence the outcome up at the top, or not very engaged at all down at the bottom? And it's not shown on this chart, but a number of major trade associations also show up on the top left in their analysis. So top left is vigorously trying to preserve the status quo. Top right would be vigorously trying to create a just transition to the zero carbon world we need. Most companies, other than the fossil fuel companies, are on the bottom right. My former employers, Google and Facebook, most companies that are widely viewed as sustainable and as leading on climate action are on the bottom right. They support climate action. They don't lobby very hard on it. So going to the last slide, the next slide, this chart highlights tech companies along with some of the fossil fuel companies and a couple of others. And the imbalance in political power and influence is clear. If we want a durable transition, we need to change that. And NGOs and the public are pushing hard in the US, mostly the Democratic Party, or at least some people in it, have been pushing for real meaningful policy. The Republican Party has aligned very strongly with the agenda that's being pushed by the fossil fuel industry, which is delay, inaction, or very weak action. And I would argue that right now our biggest problem is really about getting this transition started and accelerating it, and building then the political power to make it durable. And we don't have that political power. Part of that is what Jenny was talking about, I think, in terms of a much broader coalition and centered around people and empowering people. Our focus at Climate Voice is on getting major companies like the big tech companies to step up and advocate for the kind of bold, equitable policy that we need. And to Jenny's point, we need them to be real allies with the others who are fighting for this kind of action, not just exercise their own power for their own good, but use it to bolster the efforts of women, people of color, others who have been historically marginalized and disempowered in this system. So let me stop there and I'll turn it back to Dave.
Thanks very much, Bill. Clark is no longer stuck in traffic and is here. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Clark.
Thanks very much, David. And it's great to be here, and apologies for the delay in showing up. I have a couple of slides too, if we could put those up. So I want to talk briefly about the findings of the most recent National Academy's committee report on decarbonizing the US energy sector. And if you could move forward on the slide. You know, what the committee said, and I won't belabor this point, it's one that we've all been working from this morning, and I think all of us are working towards, and that is that decarbonization of the US energy system by 2050 is both feasible and affordable for the United States, but it is a nonetheless massive undertaking that will require not just changing out technological systems, but really fundamentally reforming how the US economy works across some fairly substantial sectors of the economy, large parts of the American workforce. And in certain ways, at any rate, all of us as individuals across the United States, rethinking our relationship with day-to-day energy practices as well as larger energy systems. And so if you could move forward, David. One of the key findings of the committee, and this committee was distinct in that it has had a strong social science imprint and participation in the committee's work, which is really the first time that the academies have done that on the future of the U.S. energy system. And so one of the pieces of that, but I will also say that this was a unanimous conclusion of the committee at large, is that if we're going to make this transformation of our infrastructures, of our economy at the pace and scale that need to happen in order to achieve decarbonization by 2050, we need to do that in a way that brings the American public along substantially, and therefore that is grounded in a robust social contract, really between the energy sector, between the public sector, and the public at large. So David, if you could advance. Our view is ultimately that creating that kind of a strong social contract as the basis for ensuring public commitment to and engagement in the work of decarbonization is really the responsibility of everyone. This is not something that local governments can do by themselves. It's not something that the federal government can do by itself. It's not something that companies can do by themselves, but it will really require everyone who is a participant in the energy sector to be engaged systematically with the public and to take actions that strengthen public support for a long-term U.S. decarbonization strategy. And so we make a number of recommendations. And so David, if you could advance to the next slide, those recommendations fall in several categories. This is an extremely high-level summary, but I've given you a link at the bottom, which is to a 4-page synthesis. If you want the 4-page version, the highlights version of our policy agenda for a just transition, we call it. But you're also welcome to read the 50-page chapter as well. But we see 4 significant areas of work that have to happen in order to ensure this social contract. So we need to create a set of national standards, analyses, forms of communication that allow us to measure transition impacts and to provide that information as early as we can to communities and workforces that are going to be involved in this transition. We need to be able to turn around and provide long-term support for these communities and these workforces in making the transition. We need to establish programs that will redress a variety of different forms of historical injustices that are embedded in the energy sector in the way that it has historically impacted communities of color, indigenous communities, low-income communities, and other disadvantaged communities. And finally, we make a number of recommendations about how the federal government can act to improve local, state, tribal, and regional planning so that federal investments and federal actions in support of decarbonization support and enhance the ability of local communities who are already leading in a number of different ways. And so with that, David, if you could go to the last slide. Thank you. I appreciate that the chance to be here today, and I'm happy to have a conversation with all of you.
Thanks very much, Clark. I have a bunch of questions myself, but I want to make sure we leave time for the audience questions to come in. So let me just ask one big question, and because I haven't had enough time to formulate it, it'll probably be a little bit rambling, but I want to get everybody's response to this question. So to a large extent, there was some agreement among the speakers about where we need to go and how, and to some extent how we need to get there. a lot of the things, the places we need to go are, objectives, but sort of translating them into concrete actions and pathways to get there is the sort of the hard part. And Jenny, you said that we really need to focus on a more integrated approach where we think about what people need from the energy system and more generally from the economy. And I guess I took your framing of the problem to be less hopeful about the possible contributions that the corporate sector could make than Bill's and Clark's framing of the problem. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's sort of the way it came to me. And so I guess I'd like to ask everybody, so to what extent do you think the private sector, can be helpful in achieving a just transition along the lines defined in Jenny's presentation? And to what extent do you think they need to be present and helpful if we're going to get there? And why don't we take it up in the order that we spoke in the first place? I mentioned you're the most, Jenny, so let you go first. And I'm going to step away quickly to deal with my dog who's making a lot of noise in the background.
Okay, so I think the question is about private sector, public sector, the role of different, of both potentially. So, I make a call for big public investments in that are needed, and I think, and that public investments are often where, as we're seeing right now being proposed, right, that where linkages and kind of integrated approach can be put forward because there can be alignment with national public investments, with local and state and municipal investments. So I think there's a big role for public investments. I guess just to say that, and I think that's what Bill is also talking about. The private sector, one of the roles the private sector could have is lobbying for those public policy and public investments, right? And the critical importance of that. Another role for private sector, obviously, is to get involved in socially responsible ways in the transformation, right? And when the vision that I put forward of energy democracy with, distributed heterogeneous mix of renewable energy potentially, right, throughout the country, throughout the world, there could be all kinds of different private sector organizations involved there, right? And I think when the concerns that I raised about concentration of wealth and power and the billionaires kind of, this extreme wealth is really not good for society at large, right? So I think there's also needs to be some balance with policy to keep private sector activities in check a little bit, right? And so that private sector and the billionaires don't control everything, right? And so there needs to be a balance, and I think we've gotten a little out of balance between private and public. So there's obviously a huge role for private sector in so many ways, and there's also ways to think about organizations that we conventionally think about private sector, corporate, in new ways with more worker-owned cooperatives or other kinds of community-owned or community cooperatives. So there's some innovations in the private sector that can also happen that can help us move to a better place and better policies and not as much of the widespread disparate inequities that are really ultimately not good for our society as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that in my work, we're focused on that imbalance of political power to a large extent, and the big companies today have through direct ownership and control of many things, through the wealth inequities, have an enormous amount of influence and control, but also through their political influence, which comes from political contributions. It comes from other ways they curry favor with policymakers, choosing where to locate a facility. And, by choosing to locate in a district, the representative there or the governor of that state may feel beholden to them. I think we definitely need public investment. We also, to do what we need to do around climate, it's going to be trillions of dollars that, 2 years ago, you might have said, there's no way the government will ever spend trillions. Okay, now these days we throw around trillions, relatively without quite so much disbelief. But even so, I think the amount of investment that will be required to really make the transition we need to make, an enormous amount of that has to be private sector. The key to my mind is what are the standards that are put in place by the government that direct that investment into things that create the low carbon, more equitable society and infrastructure that we need, as opposed to allowing business as usual to continue. And then the key point that I'm trying to make is that companies have a role in our policymaking process. And today they mostly exercise it in their own self-interest. So the fossil fuel companies are very active in shaping the policies that affect them. And that, I would argue, is to the detriment of almost all of us. Other companies, because they don't see those energy and climate related policies as affecting them so directly, mostly sit on the sidelines. And there's an opportunity, and I think a need, for those other companies to step up as allies for all of the, the broad coalition of people who are trying to shift the system and help counter the very negative voice of the entrenched special interests.
Thanks, Bill. Clark?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a great question, and I certainly don't disagree with Jenny and Bill about the either the significant role that the public sector has to play, or that the private sector also has to play a critical role. I would point out that we talk about these things as if there is a private sector and a public sector, and they're totally distinct from each other, and they operate, one is a space of rules and the other is a space of unfettered competition and ruleless behavior. Especially in the energy sector, nothing could be further from the truth. The energy sector is a hybrid space through and through. It is completely hybrid. Every facet of the energy sector has been co-designed by private sector entities and public sector actors. We have the only major place in American capitalism where regulated monopolies continue to operate as major entities in our economy. And that has always been a historical reflection of the fundamental centrality of energy to the work of a modern economy. And I think we have to demand, and by the way, the banking sector is an integral part of that. We talk about the banking sector as if it's a separate sector from the oil sector and the coal sector, and they're not. It's a single integrated entity, however the legal arrangement of the organizations plays out. Our banking sector and our infrastructure sector are not independent entities. They're entirely integrated together. And so I think what we have to do is, one, make sure that we're holding everybody fully accountable for the design of those hybridities, for the ways that we're mixing public sector principles and private sector principles together, because we know that the design of those hybridities generates outcomes. It generates the kind of concentrations of wealth that Jenny was talking about when we design them in certain kinds of ways. And it designs where those concentrations of wealth occur. We could build a fundamentally decentralized solar-based energy system in the United States. And if we still allow a handful of companies in China to manufacture all of the solar panels, we will be concentrating enormous amounts of wealth in the hands of those few companies, right? So all of this is designed. We talk about market design, we talk about regulatory design, it's all designed. And we need to be paying very careful attention to how we make those designs so that the outcomes that we get are outcomes that are more just, more equitable, less concentrated than the ones that we have had in the past.
So this is a question that's come in on the Q&A, but I'm going to paraphrase it or rephrase it a little bit. So given the power inequities that you've described and the fact that we've got this status quo set of designs out there that are sort of pushing us toward the outcomes we have now, it sort of suggests to me that what we need is something to construct something new or to reconstruct something that's really durable. And what are the prospects for doing that, given the electoral cycles that we have in this country? We have congressional elections every 2 years and a presidential election every 4 years. In recent transitions between presidents and parties, we've seen lots of wild flip-flopping back and forth on policy. How do we build that kind of long-term durable transition that I think all three of you are saying we need? And I'll leave, whoever wants to speak first is okay with me, although I guess I need to call out people for mic muting and so forth. Bill, why don't you go first?
Sure. I think it's hard. Our political system is not, especially where it has ended up, is not conducive these days to consensus building or, durability of decisions. That said, you look at healthcare, and Obama made major strides in healthcare. We could probably spend days debating, was it enough? Was it too much? Whatever, but massive changes in our healthcare system that, for all of the noise over the last 4 years, really mostly didn't get undone. And I think one of the reasons for that is that people saw the benefits. People who didn't have insurance got insurance. And there are lots of people that still don't have the healthcare they need, but many people saw real benefits, and it was hard to take it away. And I think one of the ways you create durable change is by making changes that provide real, tangible, visible value to people, and making sure it is visible to them, talking about it, not just doing some technocratic thing that will solve this problem that most people don't feel is affecting them, maybe directly, but doing it in a way that really provides value to them that they can see. And I think that, honestly, what I've seen coming out of the new administration so far, I think they are really taking that to heart. Whether they'll succeed or not, I don't know, but we have an opportunity, in the next 12 to 15 months before we're in the depths of the next congressional election cycle to make some major change on Capitol Hill. And if that shows value to people, it's going to be very hard to undo.
Yeah, I would add that, a transition or transformation isn't linear, right? It's not that we just have to stay steady and I think we need infusions of activity that then is, the whole thing about a transformation is once you start moving, you can't go back. There's no going back, right? So we've already started. We need to accelerate. And I think what's most important is to, as Bill just mentioned, demonstrate the benefits to people, right? Like that's at the core. Things have gotten so divisive, partly because of our reliance on fossil fuels, and then the fossil fuel sector's influence over politics and even cultural associations, right, that we have. And if we had been able earlier on to invest in those communities that were reliant on fossil fuel industry for basic economic, prosperity, and if we were able to support those communities without that reliance, right? Like free people up, and I mean, if you look back even to each of our recent elections, right? A lot of the most controversial things come down to our reliance on fossil fuels. We need to acknowledge that we need all hands on deck commitment to moving away from fossil fuel reliance, right? That it needs to be accepted. And the way we can do that is to help those who are reliant on fossil fuel jobs provide other jobs and other livelihoods, right? And we have not been effective in doing that. So people are hanging on to those jobs because if that's the only job you've got, that's a good job. So I think we really need to acknowledge that and make a society-wide commitment to reduce reliance on fossil fuels and support people in positive ways so that isn't a hardship for folks. It could be a cleaner, better, even more well-paying job if we structure it in that way. So there's a lot of potential here and that's what, again, this vision of energy democracy is acknowledging that we need to move away from fossil fuels toward a renewable-based future, and how we do that, and what investments we make, and how we actually make families bring greater prosperity, greater health to families and households and communities through that transformation. And that's the opportunity before us. But it's hard because we've had so much resistance, and so many of us don't even believe that that's possible. But it's totally possible, and we see that in other places.
Clark, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just add one piece. I mean, I think the point that Jenny was just making is exactly the point that we tried to make in the Academy's report, and I hope we'll be able to build on in the next report that will come out next year. But I also want to highlight something that I heard recently that I think is actually true, and that I think can help with some of this, and that is that if we succeed in creating a carbon neutral energy system for the US by 2050, and I agree, I see enormous progress in that direction happening in the energy sector and in the public sector both, and I think we will actually do it. But whatever system we get in 2050 that's carbon neutral, it's not likely to be the system that we have in 2100. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. But I think it goes to something that is important here, and that is we're very used to a particular structure of how we produce and consume energy that has been with us for a century, in some cases a century and a half now. And that stability, I think, has been extremely important to the kind of economic and frankly military success of the United States over the last 120 years, if you can call it success. Now that we're staring a variety of things in the face that are maybe not so successful. But I think that we probably ought to aim for a more dynamic energy system going forward, one which allows, one which basically encourages an ongoing reflection about how we're doing energy so that we can constantly be altering it and addressing issues that arise. I think the energy sector is always going to be so big that it's always going to have questions that we need to be asking about it in terms of, is this just, is that just? Are there better ways to do this, ways we can create better outcomes for different kinds of communities? And we ought to have the capacity built into the way we do energy to be able to do that on an ongoing basis. And I think a lot of the stability that we've seen for the past 100 years has allowed the power of incumbency to grow, has allowed concentration to grow, has allowed energy to become invisible in our policy and political discourses, so that we haven't really thought about it in the past. So I think we need to be think a little more dynamically about what energy looks like in the future.
So let me try to integrate a few questions that have come in and also throw in a spin of my own. So it sounds like everybody on the panel, there's a lot of overlap in sort of in the advice you're giving. We want to think outside the box. We want to think about new models and paradigms. We also want to think critically about how we get from A to B. And so some of the questions that are coming in are asking about, give me the specifics. And I secretly in my head, I'm hoping that these are UT students who are, really critical thinkers about an energy transition. They understand, they understand both the sort of electric side, oil and gas side, and they understand the environmental side and the economic side, and they understand the social side as well. At least I think they do. And so we're getting questions like sort of, tell me specifically what policies would make for a more open and democratic and just transition. How do we recognize that there's some risk in pushing in particular directions? So let me give you some concrete examples to sort of give you a sense of what I'm thinking of. So it looks like a distributed energy system is more expensive than a centralized energy system. It costs roughly 4 times as much to build distributed solar panels on people's roofs than to build a utility scale solar system. An all renewable system would be a lot bigger, maybe 3-4 times bigger than the current electric grid. And it would involve having a lot of stuff that isn't used very often, but still has to be paid for by somebody. So these kinds of questions, how do we get specific about this stuff and make sure we think critically? Because politicians, if they're the ones that have to enact this stuff, they're risk averse. They're going to be thinking about these risks before. They don't want to be blamed for something going wrong. We just had a big outage here in Texas, and a lot of people were, doing this in terms of whose fault it was. And so, can you help us think more specifically about how to get to these places you think we ought to go? Who wants to go first?
So I'm happy to say, I'm happy to just summarize very quickly and say, one place you can go is the Academy's report. The final chapter of that report is a 60-page list of direct policy recommendations to Congress, many of which concern precisely these kinds of things. I also want to highlight one thing that we're beginning to untangle in some recent research that various folks have been doing, and that is that it's a little bit of a myth to talk about renewable resources being more expensive. So it is true, if you ask how much does it cost to lay down a bunch of solar panels on people's roofs versus, and you do it one by one where you have the marketing costs to get each individual household signed up and so forth, and you include those, and versus a utility scale power plant, it isn't 4 to 1, but it might be 2.5 to 1. But if you account for all of the costs of building out the transmission system to get out to that utility scale power plant, what we're finding is that across the grid as a whole, it's actually a lot more comparable. And there are things that you can do in the distributed space, including buying in bulk and planning for large scale distributed deployment that can significantly reduce the cost as well. And so it probably isn't, if you really took distributed seriously, much difference in terms of the cost between those two options. So I think that what we're going to find is that a lot of the kind of conventional thinking about what makes electricity grids work is based on what you find out when you try to make tweaks to that system to add distributed or renewables, and not what it really costs to actually run a complete system differently. And there's no question that regardless of what we do, we're going to have to pay for the transition itself. And so we need to figure out where that money is going to come from. But I also think we just need to unleash creativity within the system. And that's where I'm really actually quite excited about what's happening in the energy sector, is that we've seen the banks and we've seen the electric utilities of all kinds, public, private, munis, etc., wrap their heads around the fact that they can't operate the grid 20 years from now the way they're operating it today, and begin to think much more creatively about what it's going to take to do this work in the future and how we're going to get from here to there.
Yeah, I would just add to that, exactly what Clark said about the traditional questions to ask are not actually that helpful in terms of, especially thinking about like, oh, the costs of this versus that. And I think because the benefits are not easily compared, because we're talking about and so many of the costs of our current system we aren't accounting for either. So I would encourage kind of thinking about things in a more, again, when you think about it in a more integrated way, it's not distributed versus central. It's actually both, right? We're going to have, it's not either or. It's a combination and a heterogeneous mix, and their benefits and redundancies and resilience to the system of having that heterogeneity, right? And I think, in terms of specific policies and specific actions, if you think about what we don't want is what we've seen with some of the early solar incentives, for example, in renewable energy at the state level. A lot of states offered rebates and strong incentives for folks to put solar on their roof. But those went to well-off households, right? Single-family homes, and it excluded a lot of people. And so when we do that kind of policy, we're actually perpetuating inequities and disparities, because we're giving some folks the new clean green technology and we're not giving it to others. We actually want the opposite. We want our investments in the new technologies. We want it to be an opportunity to invest in the families and households and communities that have been underinvested in for so long. And so that's where one example of something to be optimistic about, my colleague and friend, Shalonda Baker, who was a professor at Northeastern, she is now the Deputy Director for Energy Justice in the Department of Energy. And she is charged with following through on the commitment that the Biden-Harris campaign made about 40% of investments are to go to frontline communities that have been marginalized historically. And so if we think about that, how can we make those investments, and what is the impact that can have so many positives that are, beyond the decarbonization benefit, right? And I think that's where the real power and exciting creativity that Clark was talking about is really inspiring.
Bill, sorry, we only have about less than 2 minutes.
So I would say two things. One, all the questions about should the grid be designed this way or that way, what are the costs that are important? That's why I think the right place for policy to start is with standards, and then let the grid operators, the utilities, the state level regulators then get into the details of how they're going to do it well. I also would just point out, it's not just the electricity grid, it's buildings, it's transportation, the entire transportation system. And those are, structurally quite different in terms of the who holds power and so on. And then the last thing I would say is the task ahead right now for all of us is to do everything we can to get meaningful, bold, equitable policy passed at the national level. And we're not going to agree on exactly what it should look like. I think the thing we all have to do is be a little bit humble and step back and admit that whatever our idea is of the perfect policy isn't what will actually be enacted. Policy is never perfect. The other side has a much easier job. Their job is just to say, fight it out and don't get anything done. We need to actually compromise and do something meaningful. And I think that's really doable. And the people who are in power right now in Washington, I think are absolutely pushing in the right direction.
Thank you very much for that. And if we were all live, this would be the point at which I would invite everyone to applaud. So they're going to have to applaud at home for the speakers donating their time today to produce such an interesting discussion. We really appreciate it. And it looks like we're going to continue a lot of these same themes in the next panel, which is called Community Transitions, Enabling a Deep Change. So I imagine this conversation will continue over the course of the afternoon. Thanks again for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to our next moderator, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.